He had given up, starving, broken, and left to die. This German shepherd had suffered unimaginable cruelty. Every breath was a battle. Every second was agony. People saw him, but no one stopped. No one cared. Until she came. One woman, a stranger, looked into his fading eyes and did something that no one expected. What she did next was shocking, and it changed everything. But was it too late? Could love truly heal a soul shattered by pain? Stay with us. This story will break your heart, and then put it back together again. This is the heart-wrenching story of a German shepherd who had lost everything until one stranger did the unthinkable. What she did next will leave you speechless. He had once been a loyal companion, full of energy and life. His deep brown eyes had once shone with excitement whenever his owner came home, his tail wagging with pure joy. He had been a protector, a friend, a devoted family member who asked for nothing but love in return. But love, as he would come to learn, was not always returned. It all started the day his owner packed up and left. At first, the dog did not understand. He watched as furniture was carried out, as suitcases were packed, as familiar scents faded one by one. He wagged his tail, hoping that soon he would be called to jump into the car for an adventure. But the call never came. Instead, the door closed, the car drove away, and he was left behind. At first, he waited by the front door, convinced his owner would return. Hours passed, then days. He paced back and forth, ears perked up at the sound of every passing vehicle, every distant voice, every echo of footsteps that reminded him of the one person he loved most. But no one came for him. Hunger began to gnaw at his stomach. He sniffed around the yard, searching for scraps, but there was nothing left. The water bowl had dried up. The once comfortable home that had sheltered him was now just an empty, lifeless place. Confused and desperate, he ventured out into the streets. The world outside was nothing like the home he once knew. There were no soft beds, no warm meals waiting for him. Instead, there was danger at every corner. Cars sped past, their horns blaring, sending him scurrying away in fear. Strangers walked by, some glancing at him with pity, others with disgust. A few threw scraps of food his way, but most just ignored him. Days turned into weeks. His body grew weaker, his once thick fur now matted and dirty. His ribs pressed against his skin, a painful reminder of the meals he had missed. The hunger was unbearable, but even worse was the loneliness. He had been loved once. Had he done something wrong? Had he failed his owner somehow? He did not understand. Some nights he found shelter under abandoned buildings, curling up against the cold concrete. But sleep never lasted long. Other strays, just as desperate as him, would fight for any small piece of territory, any leftover scraps. He had to stay alert. The streets were not safe. His body bore the scars of his struggle. A deep wound ran across his shoulder where another starving dog had attacked him over food. His paws were cracked and bleeding from walking endlessly, searching for something, anything, to ease his suffering. His once glistening coat was now a dull, patchy mess, covered in dirt, fleas, and wounds that refused to heal. But the worst wound of all was the one no one could see, the one inside him. He had stopped hoping. There was a time when every human face had meant kindness to him. Now, he knew better. People walked past without a second glance. Some kicked at him when he got too close. Others shouted, throwing rocks to chase him away. He learned to avoid them, to keep his head down, to disappear into the shadows. He was no longer a pet, no longer a companion. He was just another forgotten soul on the streets. Then, one day, the pain became too much. His legs, weak from starvation, finally gave out. He collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving ground, too exhausted to move. His breathing was shallow, his vision blurry. This was it. This was where his story would end. The world had turned its back on him, and now he had nothing left to fight for. No strength, no hope, no reason to believe that tomorrow would be any different. And so He lay there, waiting for the darkness to take him. But fate had other plans. A car slowed down. Footsteps approached, and for the first time in a long time, someone finally stopped. Lisa had always been someone who noticed things others ignored. Maybe it was her kind heart, or maybe it was just the way she had been raised, to see beyond the surface, to care when no one else did. That was why, on that fateful evening, as she drove down the quiet road, something in the corner of her vision made her slow down. At first, it was just a dark shape by the roadside. It could have been anything. An old coat someone had tossed away, a pile of rags left behind by a careless traveller. But as she got closer, something about it felt wrong. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel as she took another glance. Her stomach dropped. It was not a pile of rags. It was a dog, a German shepherd to be exact. His body was curled up, motionless, against the rough dirt. His fur was so filthy and matted that it almost blended into the ground. His ribs were painfully visible, pressing against his skin like they were trying to break free. His legs were tucked close, as if he had been trying to shield himself from the world. Lisa swallowed hard. Her heart pounded in her chest. How long had he been there? Her mind screamed for her to pull over, but for a split second, she hesitated. She knew what happened to dogs in this condition. Animal control would take him, and if he was too sick, too far gone, they would put him down. That was the harsh reality. Could she handle that? Lisa's fingers gripped the wheel tighter. Then, as another car sped past, completely ignoring the suffering creature by the roadside, she made her decision. She was not going to be like them. Slamming on her brakes, she pulled over to the side of the road, threw her car into park, and jumped out. Her heart pounded as she approached the dog, her breath catching in her throat. Up close, it was even worse. His fur was tangled with dirt and dried blood. His paws were cracked, his nails overgrown. His face, oh God, his face was sunken, his eyes barely open, like he had already given up. Lisa knelt beside him, her hands shaking. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered, "you are not alone anymore." He did not react at first. Then, a faint flicker of movement, a slow, shallow breath. He was still alive. Lisa had no time to waste. She could feel her heart hammering in her chest as she knelt beside the frail German shepherd. Every second that passed felt like it was slipping away, like time itself was working against her. The dog's body barely moved, just the faintest rise and fall of his chest, his shallow breaths rattling with weakness. Carefully, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his matted fur. His body was burning with fever, yet at the same time, he was trembling from the cold. His skin was stretched so thin over his ribs that she could count each one. It was a sight that made Lisa's stomach twist with grief. How long had he been suffering like this? She swallowed back the lump in her throat, fighting the sting of tears that threatened to well up in her eyes. Whoever had left him like this? How could they? How could someone look into those eyes and abandon him? Lisa exhaled sharply, forcing herself to stay focused. Right now, anger would not help him. Action would. Her hands instinctively moved to her phone, but she hesitated. Should she call animal control? A rescue group? A vet? The options spun in her mind, but a horrifying truth made her pause. What if he did not make it long enough for help to arrive? What if they took one look at him and decided he was beyond saving? Lisa clenched her jaw. Number? She would not let that happen. She hurried back to her car, yanking open the backseat door. There, in a pile of miscellaneous items she always kept, was an old blanket. It was not much, but it was warm, and right now, this dog needed every bit of warmth he could get. With hurried steps, she returned to him, kneeling down once more. Gently, she draped the blanket over his frail body, tucking it around him to shield him from the cold. The dog let out a faint whimper, the sound so weak it barely reached her ears. "Do not be scared," she murmured softly, even though she knew he was probably beyond fear. He was past feeling anything, except maybe pain. Lisa knew she had to move him, but she also knew how much it would hurt him. Carefully, she slid her arms beneath him. His body was weightless, far too light for a full-grown German Shepherd. He should have been strong, muscular, powerful. But in her arms, he felt as fragile as a dying ember, barely clinging to life. A weak, pitiful whimper escaped his lips. Lisa's chest ached. "It is okay," she whispered, tightening her hold around him. "I have got you. I promise." She moved as gently as she could, but even the smallest motion made his body twitch with discomfort. His paws dangled limply. His head rested weakly against her arm. It was as if he had already accepted his fate, as if he no longer expected kindness from humans. The thought sent a sharp pain through Lisa's heart. She carefully placed him on the passenger seat, adjusting the blanket around him, making sure he was as comfortable as possible. He was barely aware of what was happening, but for the first time in what seemed like forever, he let out a slow, shaky breath. It was almost as if he was relieved. Lisa let out a breath of her own, though hers was laced with urgency. She could not waste another second. She jumped into the driver's seat and turned the key in the ignition. The car roared to life, and Lisa gripped the steering wheel, her mind racing. Where should she take him? The nearest vet was at least a 30-minute drive, and she had no idea if he would make it that long. But she had to try. She pulled onto the road, pressing her foot down on the gas, stealing quick glances at the dog beside her. He was curled up in the blanket, his body still and unmoving, but his breathing was there, shallow and uneven, but there. Every so often, she reached out, resting a hand on his side, just to reassure herself that he was still with her. "You are going to be okay," she murmured, even though she had no idea if that was true. The drive felt endless. Lisa's knuckles were white as she gripped the wheel, her jaw clenched tight with nerves. Red lights felt longer than they should have. Every slow-moving car in front of her was an obstacle she did not have time for. Come on," she muttered, tapping her fingers anxiously. The dog stirred slightly, and Lisa's heart skipped a beat. She glanced over, praying he was not slipping away. His eyes, once lifeless, fluttered open just a little. Lisa sucked in a breath. There was something there. Not just pain. Something else. A tiny flicker of trust. Lisa felt a lump rise in her throat. For a dog like him, abandoned, neglected, left to die, trusting a human should have been impossible. And yet, here he was. He was still fighting. Lisa's eyes burned with emotion, but she blinked back the tears. "Stay with me, okay?" she whispered. "Just a little longer." The dog let out a faint, barely audible sigh. Lisa's resolve hardened. She was not going to let him die. Not now. Not ever. Lisa's heart pounded as she sped toward her house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Every passing second felt like an eternity. She kept stealing glances at the dog, lying motionless on the passenger seat, his body wrapped in the old blanket. His breathing was shallow, each exhale coming out in faint, rattling gasps. Was he slipping away? The thought sent a surge of panic through her veins. "Stay with me," she whispered under her breath, as if he could hear her. Her foot pressed harder on the gas. She did not care about speed limits. Right now, nothing mattered, except getting him to safety. She could hear his weak, uneven breaths, each one a battle, a struggle. His body trembled beneath the blanket, his strength almost completely drained. He was fighting, but for how much longer? Lisa clenched her jaw. Number she would not let him give up. The drive home felt endless, even though she was only minutes away. The evening sky had deepened into a shade of navy blue, the last sliver of daylight slipping beyond the horizon. The air outside was cold, but inside the car, Lisa was burning with determination. Finally, she pulled into her driveway and threw the car into park. Without a second's hesitation, she unbuckled her seatbelt and jumped out. Rushing to the passenger side, she yanked the door open and leaned in. "Okay, buddy, I have got you," she murmured softly. Carefully, she scooped him up, cradling his frail body in her arms. He barely reacted, only letting out a soft, exhausted sigh. Lisa swallowed the lump in her throat. "He is still with me. That is all that matters." She carried him inside, pushing open the door with her shoulder. The house was quiet, the faint glow of the fireplace casting a warm light across the room. Lisa rushed over to the softest spot she could find, a thick pile of blankets near the fire, and gently laid him down. He did not move. Her chest tightened. "Stay with me," she pleaded, her voice barely above a whisper. The dog's breathing was so faint now that Lisa had to lean in to make sure he was still alive. His ribs, sharp and protruding, moved only slightly with each shallow inhale. He needed help. Now Lisa jumped to her feet and sprinted to the kitchen. She grabbed a bowl and filled it with fresh, cool water, then rushed back to his side. Kneeling down, she carefully lifted his head and pressed the rim of the bowl to his cracked lips. "Come on, buddy, just a sip," she urged gently. For a long moment, he did not respond. But then, just barely, his tongue flicked out, lapping up the tiniest drop of water. It was not much, but it was something. Lisa's heart swelled with a flicker of hope. "You are a fighter, huh?" she whispered, brushing a gentle hand over his head. His fur was rough, patchy, and tangled with dirt, but she did not care. At that moment, all she saw was a soul that had been abandoned, broken, but still holding on. She could not lose him now. Lisa fumbled for her phone with shaky hands and quickly dialed the number for the emergency vet. The line rang once, twice, then, "Northwood Animal Hospital. How can I help you?" Lisa exhaled sharply. "I found a stray," she explained quickly. "A German Shepherd. He is in terrible condition, starving, weak, sick. I do not think he will make it through the night if I do not do something." The receptionist's voice was calm, but firm. "We have closed for the night, but let me put you through to the on-call vet. Stay on the line." Lisa bit her lip, her fingers gripping the phone tighter as the call transferred. A moment later, a new voice came on. "This is Dr. Evans. Tell me everything." Lisa took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I found him on the side of the road. He is skin and bones, barely moving. I gave him some water, but he is so weak. His breathing is shallow, and he feels feverish." Dr. Evans's voice remained steady. "Okay, you are doing the right thing. Keep him warm. That is the most important thing right now. Dehydration is a huge risk, so continue offering him water in small amounts. Do not force it, just let him take what he can. If you have any electrolyte solution, mix a little into the water, and bring him in first thing in the morning." Lisa nodded, even though he could not see her. "Okay, thank you. Hang in there. He is lucky you found him," the vet said before the call ended. Lisa slowly lowered the phone from her ear. Lucky? The word echoed in her mind. This dog had been through hell, but if he was lucky, it was only because she had gotten there in time. She turned back to him, her gaze softening. He was still lying there, his eyes barely open. But there was something different about them now. Not just pain, not just exhaustion, something else. A tiny flicker of trust. Lisa felt her throat tighten. This dog had been abandoned. He had every reason to fear humans, to believe that no one cared. And yet, in this moment, he was choosing to believe in her. Lisa swallowed hard, brushing her fingers gently over his head. "You are safe now," she whispered. The dog let out a slow, weak sigh. It was the first sign that he finally believed her. Lisa stayed by his side, watching over him through the night. She did not sleep. Not really. Every time he shifted, every time his breathing hitched, she was there. She ran a damp cloth over his feverish forehead, spoke to him in hushed tones, and let him know that he was not alone. Hours passed, and as the first light of dawn crept through the window, Lisa noticed something. For the first time since she had found him, the dog was sleeping peacefully. He was still weak. He still had a long road ahead, but he was alive, and as long as he was still fighting, so was she. That night, Lisa barely slept. She stayed by the dog's side, watching over him like a guardian. She kept him warm, gave him water in small sips, whispered gentle reassurances whenever he stirred. And slowly, ever so slowly, he began to respond. By morning, when the first rays of sunlight streamed through the window, Lisa saw a change. It was subtle, but it was there. His breathing was a little steadier. His body was still frail, but there was a will to keep going. Lisa smiled through her exhaustion. "You are a fighter, huh?" The vet visit was intense. Blood tests, examinations, fluids, all things that should have terrified him. But somehow, he seemed to know. He seemed to trust her. "He is in critical condition," the vet said gravely. "But he has a chance." A chance. That was all Lisa needed to hear. She threw herself into his recovery, nursing him back to health day by day. She named him Hope, because that was what he had lost, and what she had given back to him. It was not easy. There were setbacks, struggles, but Lisa never gave up on him. And one day, after weeks of love and care, something incredible happened. As she sat beside him, stroking his now soft fur, Hope lifted his head and licked her hand. Tears welled in Lisa's eyes. For the first time since she had found him, his tail wagged. Hope had returned, and this time, he would never be abandoned again. Lisa had never driven this fast before. The speedometer climbed higher than she was comfortable with, but she could not afford to slow down. Her hands trembled as they gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles turning pale. Shadow lay motionless in the passenger seat, wrapped tightly in the blanket she had given him. Every few seconds, she turned her head to check on him, terrified that at any moment his chest would stop rising and falling. "Hold on, buddy," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The emergency vet clinic was 20 minutes away, but to Lisa, it felt like an impossible distance. She could hear Shadow's weak, rattling breaths, a sound that sent panic racing through her veins. The moment she reached the clinic, she slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car. Without hesitation, she opened the passenger door and scooped Shadow into her arms. He let out a weak whimper, his fragile body barely reacting to her touch. The doors to the clinic slid open as she rushed inside, her heart pounding in her chest. "Please, someone help me," she called out desperately. A nurse at the front desk immediately sprang into action, hurrying toward Lisa with a stretcher. 2 more veterinary technicians followed, their eyes widening at the sight of the emaciated dog in Lisa's arms. "We need to get him on fluids now," one of them called. Lisa gently placed Shadow onto the stretcher, watching as they wheeled him away toward the examination room. Her breath caught in her throat. Was this the last time she would see him alive? She sank into one of the waiting room chairs, pressing a shaky hand to her chest. The weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. She had done everything she could, but was it enough? Minutes felt like hours as she waited for an update. She chewed her lip anxiously, her fingers tapping against her knee. Every time the clinic doors swung open, she held her breath, praying it was the vet with good news. And then, finally, a doctor walked toward her, his expression unreadable. "Are you the one who brought in the German Shepherd?" he asked. Lisa nodded frantically. "Yes. Is he going to be okay?" The vet sighed, rubbing a hand over his forehead. "He is critical. He is severely malnourished, dehydrated, and suffering from multiple infections. His organs are weak, and we are worried he may not survive the night." Lisa's heart clenched. "But he has a chance, right?" The vet hesitated. "It is slim, but there is still a chance." That was all Lisa needed to hear. She wiped the tears from her eyes and straightened her back. "Then I am not leaving his side." The vet nodded, offering her a small smile. "Then let us fight for him." The night stretched on, and Lisa remained by Shadow's side. The clinic had allowed her to sit with him in the intensive care unit where he lay connected to an IV, his frail body covered in a soft blanket. He looked so small, so broken. Lisa reached out, gently brushing her fingers over his ear. "You are going to be okay," she whispered. "You are safe now." Shadow did not open his eyes, but Lisa liked to believe he could hear her. The vet had warned her. There was no guarantee he would make it through the night. His body was in survival mode, shutting down parts of itself to conserve what little energy he had left. His heartbeat was weak, his temperature dangerously low. Lisa could only watch, pray, and hope. Hours passed, and Lisa refused to move. The nurses came in periodically, checking his vitals and adjusting his IV fluids. Each time, they gave her the same cautious expression, one that said they were not sure if he would make it. But Lisa did not care about the odds. She had already decided she was not giving up on him. Somewhere around 3 a.m, Shadow stirred. Lisa's eyes widened as she saw his paw twitch slightly beneath the blanket. "Shadow?" she whispered, leaning in closer. His eyelids fluttered, struggling to open. It was barely noticeable, but it was something. Lisa's chest tightened with emotion. She reached for his paw, holding it gently in her hand. "You are fighting, huh?" she whispered, her voice thick with tears. The smallest flicker of movement answered her, a tiny attempt at lifting his head. A lump formed in Lisa's throat. She had never seen such strength in an animal before. The vets had warned her that Shadow might not survive, but at that moment, she knew. He was not giving up, and neither was she. Morning arrived with golden sunlight spilling through the clinic windows. Lisa barely realized she had been awake all night, but exhaustion did not matter. The vet walked in, a clipboard in his hands. Lisa stood immediately. "How is he?" The vet exhaled slowly before giving her a small, hopeful smile. "He made it through the night." "That is more than we expected." Lisa's knees nearly buckled in relief. "He still has a long road ahead," the vet continued, "but I think he has a real chance, especially if he has someone willing to care for him." Lisa looked down at Shadow, his chest rising and falling steadily now. He was still weak, but there was a difference in him, a subtle shift, a spark of resilience that had not been there before. A quiet realization settled in Lisa's heart. She could not leave him here. She would not leave him here. Lisa took a deep breath and met the vet's gaze. "I want to adopt him." The vet's eyebrows raised in surprise. "Are you sure? His recovery is going to take months, maybe longer. He is going to need constant care, special food, medications." "I do not care," Lisa interrupted. "He is coming home with me." The vet studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, we will do everything we can to help you both." Lisa turned back to Shadow, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and determination. He had been abandoned, left to die. But now he had a home. Now he had her. Lisa reached down, gently stroking his head. "We are in this together, buddy," she whispered. For the first time since she had found him, Shadow's eyes fully opened. And in that moment, Lisa knew. This was just the beginning. The first few days at home were the hardest. Lisa had prepared a cozy space for Shadow in the corner of her living room, layering it with soft blankets and a thick dog bed. She placed water and food nearby, but at first he barely touched them. His body was still weak, his energy too low to even lift his head for long periods. He slept most of the day, and each time he stirred, Lisa would rush to check on him. She fed him small portions throughout the day, soft, high-nutrient food recommended by the vet. The first time he took a bite, her heart swelled with hope. But the real challenge was earning his trust. Shadow had been through so much. His body was healing, but his heart was still guarded. Whenever Lisa moved too fast, he flinched. If she raised her hand to adjust a blanket, his ears flattened, and he braced himself as if expecting pain. It broke Lisa's heart. What kind of life had he lived before? Had someone hurt him? She sat beside him every day, speaking to him in a gentle voice. "You are safe now," she would whisper. "No one will ever hurt you again." At night, she slept nearby, just in case he needed anything. And slowly, little by little, he began to change. One evening, as Lisa sat on the floor reading, she felt something touch her leg. She glanced down. Shadow had moved closer, his head now resting against her knee. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She did not move, afraid she would scare him away. But then, he let out a slow sigh, his body finally relaxing. For the first time, he was letting his guard down. And Lisa knew. This was the start of something beautiful. Shadow's recovery was slow but steady. With each passing week, he grew a little stronger. His ribs were no longer visible. His fur was growing back, and the dullness in his eyes was fading. And then, one day, something incredible happened. Lisa had just come home from the store, carrying bags into the house, when she noticed Shadow watching her. His ears perked up. His body shifted slightly. Then, he stood up. Lisa froze, her heart pounding. For weeks, Shadow had barely moved unless absolutely necessary. But now, he was standing on all four legs, looking at her. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice full of awe. He took a shaky step forward, then another. Lisa dropped the bags, rushing toward him. "Oh my God, you are walking!" Tears filled her eyes as she watched him slowly make his way toward her. His movements were unsteady, but there was determination in his eyes. And when he finally reached her, something happened that Lisa would never forget. Shadow wagged his tail. A soft, slow wag. Lisa let out a broken laugh, falling to her knees and wrapping her arms around him. "You are amazing," she whispered, pressing her forehead against his. From that moment on, everything changed. Shadow's progress accelerated. Each day, he walked a little more. His appetite returned, and his body filled out. The biggest change, though, was in his spirit. Lisa could see it in his eyes. He was no longer just surviving. He was living. The day Shadow ran for the first time was the most emotional day of Lisa's life. It had been months since she found him on the roadside, barely clinging to life. Now, he stood in the middle of a wide-open field, the sun shining down on his strong, healthy body. Lisa knelt beside him, stroking his fur. "You ready, buddy?" she asked, smiling. Shadow looked up at her, his tail wagging. Then, he took off. Lisa gasped as he ran, his powerful legs carrying him across the field. His ears flopped in the wind, his tongue hung out of his mouth, and for the first time, he looked completely free. Lisa wiped at the tears streaming down her face. "You did it," she whispered. Shadow circled back, bounding toward her with a look of pure happiness. And when he reached her, he jumped, playfully, excitedly, as if saying, "Look at me, I did it." Would you have done the same in Lisa's place? Tell us in the comments below. And if you believe every dog deserves a second chance, hit the like button and subscribe for more inspiring stories. This story proves that kindness can save lives. One small act of compassion changed everything for Shadow. And who knows, maybe you could be someone's hero too. Thank you for watching. If you want to hear more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for our next incredible rescue story.